The day I caught our Homeowners Association illegally towing my restored 1967 Mustang from my own driveway, I never imagined it would spiral into a year-long battle that would expose corruption, lead to multiple resignations, and end with them trying to sue me for $50,000 in damages. What started as a simple car towing would unravel a web of deception that had been plaguing our community for years. This is the story of how I fought back and won. Before you continue reading, make sure to hit that subscribe button and notification bell to stay updated with more incredible true stories like this one. My name is Mike Thompson, and until last summer, I lived what most would consider a perfectly ordinary life in Oakridge Gardens, a quiet suburban community just outside of Portland. My single-story ranch home, with its meticulously maintained lawn and welcoming front porch, had been my sanctuary for the past 8 years. But more than the house itself, my pride and joy was my garage, where I kept my most precious possession, a 1967 Ford Mustang that I'd spent 3 years restoring with my late grandfather. The car wasn't just a vehicle, it was a testament to countless weekends spent with Grandpa Joe, learning about engines, bodywork, and the value of patience. Every scratch buffed out, every part replaced, and every detail restored held a memory of him teaching me something new. The deep burgundy paint job gleamed like a mirror, reflecting not just sunlight, but the hundreds of hours we'd invested together before he passed away. Living in Oakridge Gardens had always seemed like the perfect fit for me. The community of 200 homes was well maintained, with tree-lined streets and friendly neighbors who would wave as they walked their dogs or jogged past my house. I worked from home as a software developer, which gave me plenty of time to maintain both my property and my cherished Mustang. The HOA, while present, had always seemed reasonable enough. They handled the community pool, organized seasonal events, and kept the shared spaces looking pristine. I even served on the Architectural Review Committee for 2 years, helping neighbors navigate the guidelines for home improvements. It gave me insight into how things worked, and I prided myself on being fair and helpful. The monthly HOA meetings were usually boring affairs, discussing mundane things like replacing playground equipment or scheduling the next community garage sale. The previous HOA president, Sandra Miller, had retired and moved to Florida 3 months ago. Her replacement, Robert Davidson, seemed pleasant enough at first, a retired corporate executive who promised to modernize our community's approach to property management. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to the subtle changes that began occurring after he took office. New enforcement officers started appearing in our neighborhood, taking photos of properties and leaving violation notices for the smallest infractions. The community Facebook group began filling with complaints about aggressive enforcement and questionable fines. But since my property was always well maintained and my Mustang was kept in pristine condition in my garage, I admittedly didn't pay much attention to these early warning signs. My daily routine was simple but satisfying. I'd wake up early, have my coffee on the front porch, check my work emails, and spend my lunch breaks either tinkering with the Mustang or maintaining my yard. Weekends were for longer drives in the car, often taking it to local classic car shows where it consistently drew admiring crowds. The trophy shelf in my garage was testament to the quality of our restoration work. The neighbors closest to me, Tom and Maria Rodriguez, often joked that my car was better maintained than their marriage. They'd bring their kids over whenever. I was working on it, and I'd explain the basics of car maintenance to their teenage son, Max, who was just starting to show interest in classics. It reminded me of my time with Grandpa Joe, and I enjoyed passing on what he had taught me. Everything changed on a warm Tuesday evening in July. I had just finished waxing the Mustang and decided to leave it in the driveway overnight to drive it to a car show the next morning. It was something I'd done dozens of times before, and our HOA bylaws had no restrictions on parking classic cars in driveways. I'd checked this specifically before buying the house. That evening, I sat on my porch enjoying the sunset, admiring how the fading light played off the car's polished surface. Mrs. Henderson from across the street walked by with her golden retriever, Cooper, and stopped to chat about the upcoming community picnic. Several other neighbors drove past, waving as usual. Everything felt normal, peaceful even. I remember checking my security cameras before bed, a habit I'd developed after a series of car break-ins in a neighboring community last year. The Mustang sat safely in my driveway, its alarm system armed, looking like a magazine cover under the soft glow of my motion-activated garage lights. Looking back now, I realized that peaceful evening was the calm before the storm. Had I known what was coming, I might have done things differently. But then again, sometimes it takes a storm to expose what's been hiding beneath the surface all along. That night, I went to bed feeling content, proud of the life I'd built, the community I was part of, and especially the beautiful machine sitting in my driveway, a symbol of family, hard work, and perseverance. The events that would unfold over the next year would test all of these things in ways I never could have imagined. If you're enjoying this story so far, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe, because what happened next would shake our entire community to its core and expose a scheme that went far beyond a simple car towing incident. The security footage from that night would later become crucial evidence in my legal battle, but at that moment I slept peacefully, unaware that in just a few hours, my quiet life in Oakridge Gardens would be turned completely upside down. The sharp buzzing of my phone jerked me awake at 4:37 a.m. At first, I thought it was my alarm malfunctioning, but as consciousness crept in, I realized it was my security system's notification. Groggy and confused, I opened the app, and what I saw made my heart skip a beat. A large tow truck was backing into my driveway, its yellow warning lights silently flashing in the pre-dawn darkness. I scrambled out of bed, nearly tripping over my slippers as I raced downstairs. By the time I reached my front door, I could hear the hydraulic whine of the tow truck's lift. Throwing the door open, I rushed outside in my pajamas, only to witness my worst nightmare. My grandfather's Mustang, our labor of love, was already hoisted at an awkward angle, its front wheels dangling precariously above the ground. "Hey, stop! What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, running toward the truck. The operator, a burly man in a dark uniform, barely glanced in my direction as he continued working the controls. "HOA violation removal," he grunted, not even bothering to look up from his work. "Got the paperwork right here." "What violation?" "This is my private property. Put my car down now." My voice cracked with a mixture of panic and rage. The thought of my meticulously restored classic being manhandled by this equipment made me physically sick. The operator sighed as if I were nothing more than an inconvenience. "Look, buddy, I'm just doing my job. Take it up with your HOA. They called us. Out here, said this vehicle's in violation of community guidelines." I pulled out my phone and started recording, making sure to capture the truck's company name, license plate, and the operator's actions. "This is illegal. You have no right to take my car. I'm calling the police." "Go ahead," he shrugged, continuing. To secure my Mustang to his truck wouldn't be the first time someone called the cops. Won't change anything. My hands shaking with adrenaline, I dialed 911 while simultaneously trying to document everything happening. The dispatcher assured me they would send someone immediately, but I knew the damage could be done before they arrived. I ran back inside to grab my car keys and documentation, nearly tripping over my own feet in the process. When I emerged again, the tow truck operator was already climbing into his cab. My beautiful Mustang, now fully secured to his truck, swayed slightly in the cool morning air. The sight of my grandfather's pride and joy strapped to this predatory vehicle like some kind of trophy made my blood boil. "If you drive away with my car, I'm pressing charges," I shouted, positioning myself in front of the truck. "This is grand theft auto." The operator leaned out his window, his expression a mixture of boredom and irritation. "Sir, move away from the vehicle. I've got proper authorization from the HOA board. Here's your copy of the removal notice." He held out a piece of paper, which I snatched from his hand. The document was clearly printed on official HOA letterhead, but something felt off. The violation cited was unauthorized commercial vehicle, storage in residential driveway, a completely ridiculous claim for a restored classic car. The signature at the bottom belonged to Robert Davidson, our new HOA president. As I stood there in my pajamas, clutching this absurd document, two police cruisers pulled up with their lights flashing. Officer Sarah Martinez, whom I recognized from community outreach events, approached first. "Mr. Thompson, what seems to be the problem here?" she asked, taking in the scene. I explained the situation as calmly as I could, showing her my documentation proving ownership of both the car and the property.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The tow truck operator produced his paperwork, and Officer Martinez spent several minutes reviewing both sides. "This is a civil matter," she finally said, though I could tell from her expression that she wasn't happy about it. "The HOA has provided seemingly valid authorization for the removal. Your best course of action would be to take this up with them directly or pursue legal action if necessary." "But this is theft," I protested. "They can't just take my car without warning." "I understand your frustration," Officer Martinez replied, lowering her voice. "But legally, our hands are tied if the HOA has provided authorization. Document everything, and I'd strongly suggest consulting with an attorney immediately." I felt helpless as I watched my grandfather's Mustang being towed away, the rising sun catching its burgundy paint one last time before it disappeared around the corner. The security cameras had captured everything, but that was little consolation at the moment. As the police left and the neighborhood began stirring to life, I noticed several faces peeking out from behind curtains. Tom Rodriguez, my neighbor, came jogging over in his bathrobe. "Mike, what the hell happened? Was that your Mustang?" he asked, genuine concern in his voice. I showed him the removal notice, my hands still shaking with anger. "Robert Davidson. Happened. Apparently my restored classic car is now a commercial vehicle." Tom whistled low. "Man, that's messed up. But you know what? Sarah Miller mentioned something similar happened to her before she moved. Some bogus violation that came out of nowhere. She ended up paying a fine just to avoid the hassle." This caught my attention. "Sarah Miller, our former HOA president?" Tom nodded. "Yeah. Weird timing too, right before she suddenly decided to retire to Florida. Never seemed quite right. To me." I was about to ask more questions when my phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from the HOA, specifically from Robert Davidson himself. The subject line read, "Urgent vehicle removal notice and associated fines." Opening the email, I felt my stomach drop. Not only were they charging me $500 for the towing fee, but they were also imposing a $2,500 fine for the alleged violation. The email ended with a warning that additional daily fines would accrue until I resolved the situation. I immediately tried calling the towing company, only to be told they couldn't release my vehicle without HOA authorization. When I called Robert Davidson's number listed on the HOA website, it went straight to voicemail. Standing in my driveway, still in my pajamas, I realized this was no random incident or miscommunication. The timing, the bogus violation, the immediate fines. It all felt calculated. Something bigger was going on, and my Mustang had somehow become caught in the middle of it. I spent the next hour documenting everything, photographing the notice, saving the email, downloading the security footage and taking screenshots of our HOA bylaws, which had nothing prohibiting classic cars in driveways. Then I made 3 calls. First to my employer to take an emergency personal day, second to my insurance company, and third to James Walker, a friend from college who had become a property rights attorney. As I waited for James to return my call, I noticed an unmarked car driving slowly past my house. The driver, a woman I'd never seen before, seemed to be taking photos with her phone. When she saw me watching, she quickly drove away. Tom, who was still standing with me, shook his head. They've been doing that a lot lately. These inspection officers taking pictures of everyone's property. Started right after Robert took over. I looked down at the removal notice again, my initial shock giving way to determination. If Robert Davidson thought I would roll over and accept this abuse of power, he had seriously underestimated who he was dealing with. This car wasn't just about money, it was about family, memories, and principles, and I was prepared to fight for all of them. James Walker, my attorney friend, called back just as I was finishing my 3rd cup of coffee. The conversation with him would reveal the first glimpses of just how deep this HOA corruption ran. "Mike, I just reviewed everything you sent me," James said, his tone serious. "This isn't the first case I've heard about involving Robert Davidson." His name came up in a similar situation in Riverside Heights last year. Before I could respond, a black Mercedes SUV pulled into my driveway. Robert Davidson himself stepped out, dressed in an expensive suit that seemed excessive for 8 a.m. in a suburban neighborhood. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his posture radiated an air of authority that immediately set me on edge. "James, I'll call you back. The man himself just showed up," I said, ending the call. I was still in my pajamas, but at this point I didn't care. Robert approached with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Thompson, I trust you received our notice about your vehicle violation." "Cut the act, Robert," I replied, holding up my phone with the security footage playing. "I have video evidence of your illegal towing operation. What you did is theft, plain and simple." His smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Mike, may I call you Mike? I think there's been a misunderstanding. As HOA president, it's my responsibility to ensure all community guidelines are strictly enforced. Your vehicle was in clear violation of our commercial vehicle statutes. A restored classic car is not a commercial vehicle," I countered. "Show me where in the bylaws it says otherwise." Robert smoothly pulled out a tablet from his leather briefcase. "Actually, we've recently amended the bylaws. Any vehicle that has been displayed at public events for competitive purposes is now classified as a commercial exhibition vehicle. The board voted on this last week." "Last week?" I felt my blood pressure rising. There was no notification of any meeting or vote. That's illegal. HOA bylaw changes require proper notice and community input. Robert's smile turned condescending. "The emergency provision in our charter allows the board to make immediate changes when necessary for community welfare. Now, about those fines. Emergency provision for a classic car." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Mr. Thompson," Robert's tone turned icy, "I'd strongly advise you to focus on resolving this violation rather than questioning board decisions. The fines will continue to accumulate, and we do have ways of ensuring payment." At that moment, the same unmarked car I'd seen earlier drove by again, this time stopping briefly as the driver snapped more photos. "Ah, good," Robert nodded. "Our compliance team is quite thorough. They'll be documenting any additional violations they find." "This is harassment," I stated firmly. "Return my car immediately or I'll take legal action." Robert's smile finally disappeared. "Legal action? Against the HOA? That would be unwise. Ask around about what happened to the last few residents who tried to challenge our authority. Their properties somehow developed numerous expensive violations." He emphasized the word expensive with obvious relish. He turned to leave but paused at his car door. "Oh, and Mike, I noticed your grass is approximately 3 inches high. The new guidelines also passed last week specify a maximum height of 2 inches. That'll be an additional $100 daily fine until corrected. I'd get on that if I were you." As he drove away, I stood there seething. My phone buzzed with another email. The grass violation notice, already in my inbox. This wasn't just about my car anymore. This was about power and control. I immediately called James back. "You mentioned Riverside Heights. What happened?" "Now there." James sighed heavily. "Robert Davidson served on that HOA board for 6 months last year. During his tenure, there was a suspicious pattern of aggressive fines, sudden bylaw changes, and forced property sales. Several residents filed complaints, but he resigned and moved before anything could stick." "Forced property sales?" I asked, a chill running down my spine. "Yes," James confirmed. "The pattern was always the same. Target a property they wanted, create impossible violations, stack up massive fines, then force a sale when the owner couldn't pay. The properties were always quickly bought up by shell companies that coincidentally had ties to board members." I walked to my garage and pulled out an old file box. Inside were documents from my time on the Architectural Review Committee, including records of all property sales in the past 5 years. What I found made my stomach turn. In the 3 months since Robert had taken over, there had been 6 distressed property sales in our community, more than the previous 2 years combined. All sold well below market value to different LLCs, all registered to the same business address. My phone buzzed again, another email from the HOA. This one contained photos of my property from multiple angles, each highlighting supposed violations. A crack in my driveway, peeling paint on a window trim, an unapproved garden hose holder. The total fines now exceeded $5,000. I spent the next hour scanning through community Facebook groups and next-door posts, finding similar stories. Other residents had faced sudden violations, impossible fines, and aggressive enforcement. Many had simply paid up to avoid further harassment. Those who resisted faced escalating pressure until they either complied or moved. Tom Rodriguez came by again, this time with a thick folder under his arm. "Mike, you need to see this," he said, spreading documents on my kitchen table. "My wife Maria works at the county records office. These are the incorporation papers for all the LLCs that have been buying properties in our neighborhood." The documents revealed a complex web of shell companies, all leading back to a parent corporation, Davidson Development Group. Robert wasn't just our HOA president. He was a professional property flipper who used HOA positions to force sales. "There's more," Tom added grimly. "Remember Sarah Miller, the previous president? She didn't retire to Florida. She's living in an apartment across town. Maria saw her last week at the grocery store. She looked terrible. Said something about getting out before it was too late." Just then, another car drove by slowly, the third in 2 hours. The message was clear: I was being watched. But they had made a crucial mistake in choosing their target. This wasn't just about a car anymore. It was about exposing a system of corruption that had been terrorizing our community. I picked up my phone and called James. "I need you to file an emergency injunction right now. And then I need you to help me dig into everything about Robert Davidson and his development group. He picked the wrong person to mess with." "On it," James replied. "But Mike, be careful. These people play dirty when their schemes are threatened." Looking out my window at another slow-moving car, I realized this was just the beginning. Robert Davidson thought he could bully and intimidate his way to another forced sale. He was about to learn that some people don't scare easily, especially when they have nothing left to lose but everything to fight for. The next morning, I woke up early with a clear plan of action. James had filed the emergency injunction late last night, and my first priority was gathering enough evidence to build a solid case. But as I stepped outside to retrieve my morning paper, I immediately noticed something was wrong. My entire front lawn was covered in small orange flags, each marked with a different violation number. I counted 47 flags in total, dotting my previously pristine lawn like some kind of bizarre art installation. Each flag corresponded to a new violation. Everything from improper soil composition to non-regulation mulch depth in my flower beds. The pettiness was almost comical, but the implications were serious. Pulling out my phone, I started documenting each flag, creating a spreadsheet to track the absurdity. As I photographed the 23rd flag, a familiar black Mercedes pulled up across the street. Robert Davidson emerged, accompanied by two people I'd never seen before. A woman in a sharp business suit and a man carrying what looked like professional surveying equipment. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," Robert called out, his voice carrying that same artificial pleasantness. "I see you've discovered our comprehensive property inspection results. Our new compliance team is quite thorough, wouldn't you agree?" I continued photographing flags, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a response. This seemed to irritate him. "You know," he continued, his tone hardening, "this could all go away very easily. The violations, the fines, even the matter with your commercial vehicle. The HOA would be willing to resolve everything amicably in exchange for a reasonable offer on your property, of course." That got my attention. "So that's what this is really about? Forcing me to sell?" Robert smiled, but it didn't reach. His eyes. "Think of it as an opportunity, Mike. Your property has potential. We're prepared to offer you a fair price considering all the violations and necessary repairs." "My property isn't for sale, Robert, and I have a meeting with my attorney in an hour to discuss your illegal towing and harassment campaign." The woman in the business suit stepped forward. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Jennifer Harris, legal counsel for the HOA. I'd strongly advise against pursuing any legal action. HOAs have broad authority to enforce community standards. Fighting this will only result in more expenses for you." I held up my phone, making sure they could see I was recording. "Interesting. So you're officially representing the HOA while threatening a homeowner? I'm sure the State Bar Association would love to hear about this." Jennifer's professional demeanor cracked slightly. She glanced at Robert, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Thompson," she said curtly. "In the meantime, you might want to review the latest violation notices. The fines are quite substantial." As they walked away, the man with the surveying equipment lingered, setting up his tripod on the sidewalk. He began taking measurements of my property line, making careful notes on a clipboard. I immediately called James and explained what had just happened. "This is perfect," James said, his voice excited. "Keep recording everything." Their pressure campaign actually helps our case. I've been doing some digging into Robert Davidson's past, and you won't believe what I found. James explained that he'd uncovered a pattern of similar behavior in 3 other communities across 2 states. Robert would join HOA boards, usually taking over as president within months. Then the aggressive violations would start, always targeting specific properties. Those properties would eventually be sold under pressure to shell companies, only to be flipped for massive profits months later. "But here's the interesting part," James continued. "In each case, he worked with the same team, including a lawyer named Jennifer Harris. She's been reprimanded by the Bar Association twice for ethical violations, but somehow keeps her license." While on the phone with James, I noticed something odd about the surveyor's behavior. He seemed to be paying particular attention to my garage, taking multiple measurements and photos. Something about his movements seemed off for a typical property survey. I ended the call with James and walked over to the surveyor. "Excuse me, what exactly are you measuring?" The man jumped slightly, clearly not expecting to be confronted. Just routine property line verification, HOA requirement." "Really? Because it looks like you're focusing on my garage. Mind showing me your surveyor's license?" He quickly packed up his equipment and hurried away, practically running to a car parked around the corner. I managed to snap a photo of his license plate before he drove off. Back inside, I began organizing all the evidence I'd collected so far. Security footage of the illegal towing, photos and videos of Robert's visits and threats, documentation of all the sudden violation notices, records of the shell companies buying properties, screenshots of community complaints about similar harassment, the surveyors, license plate and suspicious behavior. I created 3 copies of everything. One for James, one for my personal records, and one stored securely in the cloud. If they were planning to escalate further, I wanted to be prepared. Around noon, my doorbell rang. It was Mrs. Chen from 2 doors down, an elderly widow who'd lived in the community for over 20 years. "Mr. Thompson," she said quietly, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "I saw what they did to your car. The same thing happened to my late husband's vintage Corvette last year. They kept adding fines until we couldn't pay. We had to sell it to cover the HOA fees." Her hands trembled as she handed me a folder. "I kept all the paperwork, but I was too scared to fight them. Maybe it can help you." Inside the folder was a detailed record of violations, fines, and threatening letters, all following the same pattern I was experiencing now. The final document was a bill of sale for the Corvette to a company called Davidson Classic Cars, LLC. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen," I said, carefully copying every document. "This helps more than you know." As she left, I noticed another slow-moving car passing by my house. But this time, instead of feeling intimidated, I felt energized. Robert Davidson had built his scheme on people being too afraid or overwhelmed to fight back. He wasn't expecting someone to systematically document everything and build a case. I spent the rest of the afternoon reaching out to other neighbors, carefully documenting their stories. A pattern emerged. Robert and his team would target properties they wanted, usually homes with unique features or development potential. They'd use the HOA's authority to harass owners until they gave up and sold. By evening, my phone was buzzing constantly with new violation notices. They'd added another 30 flags to my lawn, and the total fines now exceeded $15,000. But instead of feeling defeated, I felt more determined than ever. Every new violation was just more evidence of their harassment campaign. I ended the day by setting up additional security cameras around my property and installing a motion-activated recording system. If Robert Davidson wanted to play dirty, he was about to learn that some people know how to fight back and document everything. The next day, I woke up to find my inbox flooded with messages from neighbors, but not the kind of support I was expecting. Overnight, the community Facebook group had exploded with posts about me, painting a very different picture than reality. "Dangerous commercial activity in residential area," read the top post, authored by a newly created account. It included photos of my Mustang at various car shows, suggesting I was running an illegal business from my home. The comments section was filled with concerned neighbors, many of whom I'd known for years, now questioning my character. Another post, shared by Jennifer Harris herself, detailed how certain residents were undermining community property values with their selfish and unsafe activities. While it didn't name me directly, the implications were clear, especially with Robert Davidson commenting beneath, "The board is taking appropriate action to protect our community's interests." I was in the middle of documenting these posts when my phone rang. It was Maria Rodriguez, Tom's wife. "Mike, you need to see what's happening at the emergency HOA meeting right now." she whispered. I'm streaming it from my phone. Emergency. Meeting. I didn't receive any notice, I said, though I wasn't surprised. Nobody did except the board's supporters. They're voting on new security measures because of alleged dangerous activities in the neighborhood. I quickly logged into the community's video conference system using my old architectural committee credentials, which thankfully still worked. What I witnessed made my blood boil. Robert Davidson stood at the podium in the community center, addressing a carefully selected group of about 30 residents. Behind him, a slideshow displayed photos of various problem properties, with my house featured prominently. As your HOA president, it's my duty to protect our community's safety and property values, Robert declared, his voice dripping with false concern. We've uncovered evidence of unauthorized commercial activities, dangerous vehicle modifications, and even potential criminal enterprises operating within our neighborhood. The projection switched to a photo of my Mustang, clearly taken at a charity car show last month. This vehicle, for example, has been modified far beyond safety regulations. Our experts have deemed it a hazard to our community. I noticed Jennifer Harris in the background, nodding gravely at all the right moments. The experts Robert mentioned were probably the same unlicensed surveyor who'd run away when questioned. Furthermore, Robert continued, we have reason to believe certain residents are using these modified vehicles for illegal street racing and unauthorized business ventures. This puts our children at risk. The audience gasped on cue. I recognized several faces, people I'd helped with home improvement approvals, neighbors I'd invited to barbecues. Now they sat there, absorbing these ridiculous lies without question. Susan Parker, who'd borrowed my lawnmower just last week, raised her hand. What can we do to protect ourselves? Robert's practiced smile widened. I'm glad you asked. The board is proposing several new security measures, including expanded surveillance, stricter vehicle regulations, and most importantly, the authority to expedite the removal of problem residents who refuse to comply with our safety standards. My hands clenched into fists as I watched them vote unanimously to approve these emergency measures. The whole thing was a sham, designed to create fear and justify their actions against me and anyone else who stood in their way. Minutes after the meeting ended, a new wave of posts flooded the community Facebook group. Concerned neighbors shared their fears about dangerous vehicles and suspicious activities. Some even claimed to have witnessed late-night racing, despite my Mustang having been impounded for days. The manipulation was both impressive and terrifying. Robert had orchestrated a perfect campaign of fear and misinformation, turning my neighbors against me before I could even defend myself. I was documenting the latest round of posts when Tom Rodriguez rushed over, looking worried. Mike, it's worse than we thought, he said, catching his breath. Maria just called from the records office. She found something you need to see. He handed me a stack of papers, property records for recent sales in our community. Each showed the same pattern: massive fines, forced sales, and properties eventually transferred to Davidson Development Group through various shell companies. But here's the crazy part, Tom continued. These properties form a pattern. He laid out a map of our neighborhood, marking each affected house. They're creating a continuous strip of properties, all connected. And guess what's at the center? My house. There's more, Tom added grimly. Maria found permit applications filed by Davidson Development Group. They're planning something big, a commercial development right through the middle of our neighborhood. Your property is key because my lot connects both sides of their acquired properties. I finished, the realization hitting me hard. They need my land to complete their plan. Just then, my phone buzzed with a new email from the HOA. The subject line read, "Urgent, immediate action required. Safety violations." The email detailed new violations found during their emergency inspection, including unauthorized commercial signage, my car show trophies visible through the garage window, hazardous mechanical equipment storage, my standard car maintenance tools, non-compliant security modifications, the cameras I'd installed to protect myself. The total fines now exceeded $25,000 with a 48-hour deadline to either pay or face legal action. As I read through the ridiculous violations, another notification popped up. Someone had posted a petition in the community Facebook group calling for my removal from the neighborhood for dangerous and disruptive activities. It already had dozens of signatures. The systematic destruction of my reputation was nearly complete. In just a few days, Robert had transformed me from a respected neighbor into a community menace. People who'd known me for years were now avoiding eye contact when they walked past my house. But Robert had made one crucial mistake in his manipulation campaign. He'd left a paper trail. Every fake violation, every emergency meeting, every shell company transaction created documentation. And thanks to Maria's discovery, we now knew his true motives. I immediately called James to share the new information. "This changes everything," he said excitedly. "If we can prove they're using HOA authority to force sales for a commercial development, that's not just harassment, it's fraud. Keep gathering evidence, Mike. The more they try to pressure you, the stronger our case becomes." As I ended the call, I noticed another slow-moving car passing my house. But this time, instead of feeling intimidated, I smiled and waved at the camera I knew was photographing me. Robert thought he was documenting my violations, but in reality, he was just adding to the evidence of his own harassment campaign. The next 48 hours brought a relentless escalation that made the previous days seem almost peaceful by comparison. It started with a certified letter delivered at 7 a.m., a formal notice from Jennifer Harris's law firm demanding immediate payment of all fines, now totaling $32,750 after additional administrative fees were added. But that was just the beginning. As I sat at my kitchen table documenting the latest notice, a loud commotion outside caught my attention. A team of workers in official-looking uniforms was setting up yellow caution tape around my entire property. Large signs reading, "Safety, Hazard, Do Not Cross," were being hammered into my lawn, right next to the forest of orange violation flags. I immediately started recording with my phone as I approached the workers. "Excuse me, what exactly are you doing on my property?" The crew foreman pulled out a clipboard. "HOA orders, sir. Your property has been designated a public safety risk due to suspected hazardous materials storage and unauthorized commercial activity. We're required to establish a containment perimeter." Hazardous materials? That's ridiculous. I scanned the paperwork he showed me. The work order was signed by Robert Davidson and included a lengthy list of alleged dangers, including potentially explosive vehicle modifications and unsafe chemical storage, obviously referring to my basic car maintenance supplies. As the workers continued their task, a small crowd of neighbors gathered to watch. I could hear their whispered conversations, filled with speculation and concern. Robert's propaganda was working perfectly. Every new safety measure reinforced the narrative that I was somehow dangerous to the community. My phone buzzed continuously with notifications from the neighborhood Facebook group. New posts appeared hourly, each more outrageous than the last. "My children are afraid to walk. Past that house now. I heard he's running an illegal chop shop. Someone said they saw strange people coming and going at night." The stories were completely fabricated, but they spread like wildfire. People I'd known for years were now sharing and commenting on these posts, adding their own embellishments to the growing mythology of my supposed crimes. Around noon, another black SUV pulled up, this time carrying what appeared to be a news crew. A reporter I recognized from the local station approached my property line, cameraman in tow. "Mr. Thompson, Jessica Chen from Channel 8 News. We're doing a story on dangerous commercial activities in residential areas. Would you care to comment on the allegations against you?" I immediately recognized the setup. "Did Robert Davidson contact your station?" The reporter's slight hesitation told me everything I needed to know. "We received an anonymous tip about concerning activities in this neighborhood." "Let me guess," I interrupted, "along with photos and a list of violations provided by the HOA." Before she could respond, James's car pulled into my driveway. He'd been scheduled to come review our evidence, but his timing couldn't have been better. "This property is currently involved in legal proceedings," he announced loudly, approaching the reporter. "Any defamatory statements broadcast about my client will result in immediate legal action against your station. Would you like my card?" The news crew packed up quickly after that, but the damage was already spreading. Within hours, clips of my caution-taped property appeared on social media, usually accompanied by vague but ominous warnings about community safety. The pressure continued to mount throughout the afternoon. Animal control showed up to investigate. Reports of suspicious noises coming from my garage, despite my car being impounded days ago. A city code inspector arrived to check complaints about unauthorized construction, though no construction was happening. Each visit was documented, photographed, and added to the growing pile of evidence of harassment. But the real shock came around 4 p.m. when Mrs. Chen hurried over, clearly distressed. "Mr. Thompson," she whispered, nervously glancing around, "I just overheard something at the community center. Robert Davidson was meeting with someone. They didn't see me behind the filing cabinets. They're planning to condemn your property." "Condemn it? They don't have that authority," I said, though my stomach tightened. "They mentioned something about chemical contamination tests. The man with Robert said they could find whatever they need to find. They're coming tomorrow morning." I immediately called James with this new information. "They're getting desperate," he said, "but this might work in our favor. If they falsify environmental tests, that's criminal fraud. We need to be ready when they show up." I spent the evening setting up additional cameras and preparing for whatever tomorrow might bring. But around midnight, something unexpected happened. A knock at my door. Through the security camera, I saw a familiar face. Brian Foster, one of the workers who'd put up the caution tape earlier. He looked nervous. "Mr. Thompson," he said when I opened the door, "I need to tell you something. What they're doing to you, it's not right, and tomorrow's inspection isn't real." Brian explained that he'd overheard Robert and Jennifer discussing their plans. The environmental testing company they'd hired was owned by Robert's brother-in-law. They planned to plant evidence of contamination, then use it to force an emergency condemnation of my property. "They've done this before," Brian continued, pulling out his phone. "I took pictures of their paperwork when they weren't looking. They have a whole system worked out." The photos showed detailed plans for what they called Operation Clean Sweep, a systematic approach to forcing out homeowners who refused to sell. My case was labeled Phase 3, with specific strategies for escalating pressure through violations, fines, and manufactured emergencies. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. Brian looked down. "Because they did the same thing to my parents last year in Riverside Heights. Dad had a stroke from the stress. They lost everything. I spent the next hour copying every photo and document Brian provided, then helping him send everything to James. As he left, he turned back one last time. "Be careful tomorrow," he warned. "They're getting desperate, and desperate people are dangerous." Looking out at my caution-taped yard under the streetlights, I couldn't help but agree. Robert's campaign of pressure and manipulation was reaching its climax. Tomorrow would either break me or provide the evidence we needed to bring him down. The question was, who would survive the confrontation? The morning of the environmental inspection arrived with an unexpected twist. As I watched through my security cameras at 6 a.m., 3 unmarked white vans pulled up to my property. Men in hazmat suits began unloading equipment, including what appeared to be sophisticated testing devices and sampling kits. Thanks to Brian's warning, I was prepared. James had arranged for Clayton Murphy, a certified environmental inspector, from an independent firm to be present during the entire inspection. He arrived just as the hazmat team was setting up their perimeter. "Remember," Clayton whispered as we watched from my porch, "document everything they do. If they're planting evidence, they'll have to break protocol to do it." Robert Davidson arrived minutes later, stepping out of his Mercedes with Jennifer Harris and a man in an expensive suit who was introduced as Dr. Richard Maxwell, the lead environmental scientist. What they didn't know was that Clayton had already researched Dr. Maxwell's credentials, or rather, his lack thereof. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," Robert called out, his voice carrying its usual false cheerfulness. "I trust you received notice of today's mandatory environmental assessment." "You mean the notice that was emailed timestamped at 3 a.m.? "Yes, I got it." I gestured to Clayton. "As did my independent environmental consultant who will be observing your inspection." I saw a flash of concern cross Jennifer's face as she whispered something to Robert. Dr. Maxwell's reaction was even more telling. He physically flinched when Clayton introduced himself and mentioned his credentials. The inspection began with soil sampling near my garage. Through my security camera's zoom function, I could clearly see one of the workers dropping something into the testing area just before taking the sample. Clayton noticed too, marking the exact time and location in his notebook. "Interesting. A technique they're using," he muttered. "Completely contra to EPA standards for residential testing. Almost like they're trying to contaminate the samples rather than test them." As the morning progressed, more neighbors gathered to watch the spectacle. Robert had positioned himself near the growing crowd, speaking in hushed but carrying tones about community safety and hidden dangers. The performance was clearly rehearsed, designed to create maximum dramatic effect. Around 10 a.m., Dr. Maxwell approached Robert with an appropriately grave expression. "Mr. Davidson, we're getting some concerning readings. The levels of volatile organic compounds are far above acceptable limits." "That's fascinating," Clayton interrupted loudly, "considering your testing equipment isn't actually turned on. Those units have indicator lights. They're all dark." The crowd murmured as Dr. Maxwell sputtered, trying to explain the specialized stealth testing mode his equipment supposedly used. But the damage to his credibility was done. That's when things got interesting. As I watched through my security feed, I noticed one of the hazmat workers behaving oddly near my garage. He kept returning to the same spot, each time appearing to adjust something on the ground. I zoomed in with the camera and couldn't believe what I saw. The worker was actually drilling small holes in my concrete and inserting what looked like capsules into them. Clayton confirmed my suspicions. They were trying to plant evidence of chemical seepage. "Got you," I whispered, saving the footage. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Henderson, my elderly neighbor, who walked her golden retriever Cooper past my house every morning, approached me with trembling hands. "Mr. Thompson," she said quietly, "I think you should see this." She handed me her phone, showing a video she'd taken early that morning before the inspection team arrived. It clearly showed 2 men in regular clothes, not hazmat suits, spreading something on my property in the pre-dawn darkness. "I always walk Cooper at 5 a.m., she explained. "They didn't see us behind the Andersons' bushes." Cooper started, acting strange near where they were spreading that stuff. Wouldn't go near it. I immediately sent the video to James and Clayton. This was exactly the kind of evidence we needed. Proof of tampering before the official inspection even began. As the morning wore on, Dr. Maxwell's team became increasingly flustered. Clayton's presence had clearly disrupted their planned performance. Their soil samples weren't showing the contamination they'd expected, despite their earlier tampering. That's when Robert made a crucial mistake. Frustrated by the failing plan, he pulled Dr. Maxwell aside for a heated discussion. Unfortunately for them, they chose to have this conversation right in front of one of my security cameras, with crystal clear audio. "I don't care what it takes," Robert hissed. "Find something we can use. The development contract requires all these properties by the end of the month. If we don't get control of this lot, the whole deal falls apart." "I'm trying," Maxwell replied, "but that environmental consultant keeps watching us. We can't place the samples like we planned." The entire exchange was captured in high definition, including Jennifer Harris nodding along in the background. I couldn't have asked for better evidence of their conspiracy, but they weren't done yet. Around noon, Robert decided to change tactics. He approached me with what looked like an official document. "Mr. Thompson, given the preliminary findings of our inspection, we're providing you one last opportunity to resolve this situation amicably." He held out the paper. "This is an offer to purchase your property at market value, minus the accumulated fines and remediation costs, of course." I took the document, making sure my body camera captured every word. The offer was insultingly low, less than half my property's actual value. "And if I refuse?" Robert's smile turned predatory. "Then we'll have no choice but to proceed with emergency condemnation. The fines alone are now over $50,000, and the environmental remediation costs could run into hundreds of thousands. You'll lose everything." "Like Brian Foster's parents did?" I asked quietly. Robert's smile faltered for just a moment. "I'm not familiar with that situation." "Really? That's not what the documents show." I watched his expression carefully. "You know, it's interesting how many properties you've condemned for environmental hazards in different communities. Always following the same pattern, always ending up in the hands of Davidson Development Group." The color drained from Robert's face. Behind him, Jennifer Harris was already pulling out her phone, probably to call damage control. But I wasn't finished. "By the way, Dr. Maxwell, Clayton here has some questions about your certification. Apparently, the Environmental Protection Agency has no record of you ever being licensed to perform residential testing." The following hour was chaos. Dr. Maxwell disappeared during a phone call, never to return. The hazmat team quickly packed up their equipment, conveniently forgetting some of their sampling materials, which Clayton carefully collected as evidence. By early afternoon, my property was clear of caution tape and hazmat suits, but the real damage had been done. To Robert's plan, not my property. Between Mrs. Henderson's video, my security footage, and Clayton's expert documentation of their fraudulent testing methods, we had assembled an ironclad case of criminal conspiracy. As I watched Robert's Mercedes speed away, I couldn't help but smile. He thought he was orchestrating an environmental inspection, but instead, he'd given us the evidence we needed to expose his entire operation. With the failed environmental inspection still fresh in everyone's minds, I spent the rest of the day working with James and Clayton to compile our growing mountain of evidence. But what we discovered as we dug deeper would blow the case wide open in ways none of us expected. Clayton's colleague at the EPA had sent over a comprehensive report on Dr. Maxwell's history. Not only was he not a licensed environmental inspector, but he'd been involved in similar fraudulent testing schemes in at least 5 other states. Each time, the properties in question had mysteriously ended up in the hands of different shell companies, all leading back to Davidson Development Group. "Look at this pattern," James said, spreading documents across my dining room table. Every community where Robert served on an HOA board experienced the same sequence of events: sudden rule changes, aggressive fines, environmental scares, and forced sales. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Around 7 p.m., my doorbell rang. Standing on my porch was Sarah Miller, our former HOA president, who had supposedly retired to Florida. "I've been watching what's happening to you," she said, her hands clutching a thick manila envelope. "It's exactly what they tried to do to me." Sarah's story filled in crucial gaps in our understanding. She hadn't willingly retired. She'd been forced out after discovering Robert's true plans for our community. The retirement to Florida story was part of a non-disclosure agreement she'd been pressured to sign. "But they didn't know I kept copies of everything," she said, opening the envelope. Inside were documents that made our jaws drop. Detailed plans for a massive commercial development that would cut right through our neighborhood. The plans, dated months before Robert even joined our HOA, showed a proposed luxury shopping complex and high-rise apartments. Properties were marked in different colors based on their acquisition difficulty, with my house highlighted in red as a key strategic parcel. "They needed your property specifically," Sarah explained, "because it sits at the intersection of their planned main entrance. Without your lot, the whole project falls apart." As we examined the documents, more disturbing details emerged. Robert's development group had partnered with city officials to secretly rezone our entire neighborhood. The environmental testing scam was just one part of a larger strategy to devalue properties and force residents out. "When I discovered these plans," Sarah continued, her voice shaking, "they threatened to destroy me, said they'd fabricate evidence that I'd embezzled HOA funds. I was scared, so I took their deal and stayed quiet, but I can't watch them do this to someone else." While we were reviewing Sarah's documents, my phone buzzed with an urgent message from Brian Foster. He'd done some digging of his own and found something crucial: the connection between Robert's development group and a series of environmental testing companies. "They're all registered to different addresses," Brian's message read, "but they all use the same bank account. I found the records in my parents' case. They're not just fabricating violations, they're running a full-scale fraud operation." James immediately began cross-referencing the new information with our existing evidence. The picture that emerged was staggering in its scope. Robert Davidson wasn't just a corrupt HOA president. He was the mastermind of a sophisticated real estate fraud scheme operating across multiple states. "This is way bigger than HOA harassment," James said, his eyes wide as he connected the dots. "They're using fraudulent environmental testing to manipulate property values, forcing sales through fabricated violations, and secretly rezoning residential areas for commercial development. It's genius in an evil way." But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source within Robert's own organization. Around 9 p.m., I received an anonymous email with dozens of internal Davidson Development Group documents. The sender identified themselves only as a concerned employee who couldn't stomach the corruption anymore. The documents included internal memos discussing their acquisition strategy for targeting specific properties, emails between Robert and city officials discussing secret rezoning plans, financial records showing millions in profits from their forced sale schemes, a list of cooperative HOA board members who had been paid to support their plans, detailed scripts for their environmental testing scams. "This is explosive," James said as we reviewed the files. "With Sarah's testimony and these documents, we're not just looking at civil violations anymore. This is criminal conspiracy, wire fraud, and corruption." Just as we were processing this flood of new information, another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Mrs. Rodriguez called from the county records office with an urgent discovery. "Mike, I found something weird in the property records," she said. "Remember those shell companies buying up houses in our neighborhood? They all filed paperwork on the same day to change their corporate structure. And guess who showed up as the new controlling partner in each one? Who? Jennifer Harris, Robert's lawyer. She's not just representing him, she's directly profiting from these forced sales. That's a massive ethical violation for an attorney." The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking. Robert had created an elaborate web of shell companies, fake environmental testing firms, and corrupted officials to systematically force people from their homes for profit. My resistance to their scheme had unknowingly threatened to expose their entire operation. As if to confirm the stakes, my security system pinged with an alert. The cameras caught two men in dark clothing attempting to access my garage. When I activated the floodlights remotely, they fled, but not before the cameras captured clear images of their faces. James ran their images through a database and got another shocking hit. Both men had been involved in suspicious fires at problem properties in other communities where Robert had operated. "They're getting desperate," James warned. "With Sarah coming forward and all this evidence piling up, they know their whole operation is at risk. We need to move fast." I spent the rest of the night copying and securing all our evidence in multiple locations. If Robert's past patterns held true, he wouldn't go down without a fight. But for the first time since this ordeal began, I felt like we had the upper hand. The question now wasn't just about saving my property. It was about exposing a massive criminal enterprise that had been preying on homeowners across multiple states. Robert Davidson had picked the wrong property owner to intimidate, and his entire corrupt empire was about to come crashing down. The next morning arrived with an unexpected development that would push this conflict to its climax. As I stepped out to document the latest batch of violation flags in my yard, I noticed something different about my garage door. Small holes drilled near the lock mechanism. My security cameras had captured the entire attempted break-in from the previous night in stunning clarity. The two men had been methodical, professional, and clearly experienced. They'd only fled when my security lights activated, but not before attempting to compromise my garage door's locking system. I was on the phone with James discussing the break-in attempt when Tom Rodriguez came running over, out of breath and visibly shaken. "Mike, you need to see this right now," he gasped, holding up his tablet. "They just posted the agenda for tonight's emergency HOA meeting." The document displayed on his screen made my blood run cold. Listed under emergency actions was a resolution to invoke the HOA's rarely used eminent domain clause, a provision that, under certain extreme circumstances, allowed them to seize property for community benefit. "They can't do that," I said. But Tom wasn't finished. "There's more. Maria just called from the records office. Robert filed paperwork this morning declaring your property a public health hazard based on yesterday's environmental findings. They're trying to force an emergency condemnation before we can challenge their fake test results." Just then, a large white van pulled up in front of my house. The side displayed a logo for Advanced Security Solutions, but the men who stepped out weren't wearing any uniforms. They began unloading equipment that looked suspiciously like surveillance gear. Under HOA Emergency Resolution 47B-1, of them announced when I approached, "We're installing additional security monitoring to protect the community from hazardous activities." I immediately started recording with my phone. "You have no authority to install anything on my property." The lead technician pulled out a document bearing Robert's signature. "Actually, we do. The resolution grants us full access for community safety purposes. If you interfere, you'll face additional fines and potential criminal charges." Before I could respond, the screech of tires announced Robert's arrival. His Mercedes stopped abruptly in front of my house, and he emerged looking more polished and arrogant than ever. "Mr. Thompson," he called out, straightening his expensive tie, "I see you've met our new security team. Given the serious nature of yesterday's environmental findings, the board has authorized emergency measures to protect the community." "You mean the fraudulent findings from your fake environmental expert?" I countered. "The one who isn't actually licensed." Robert's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. "I'd be very careful about making unfounded accusations, Mike, especially given your current situation." He gestured to the security team, who were now setting up cameras pointed directly at my house. "The board meeting tonight will address the multiple serious violations on your property. I strongly suggest you attend. It may be your last chance to resolve this amicably." As Robert turned to leave, he paused. "Oh, and about your little investigation into our operations, I'd recommend dropping it. Some matters are better left unexplored." The threat was clear, but he'd made a crucial mistake. My body camera had captured every word, every gesture, every implied threat. James had advised me to wear it constantly, and now I understood why. Throughout the day, the pressure continued to mount. More violation notices arrived hourly. The security team installed their cameras, deliberately positioning them to observe every entrance to my house. Slow-driving cars constantly circled the block, their occupants taking photos. But the real breaking point came that afternoon. I was documenting the security team's activities when Sarah Miller called, her voice trembling. "Mike, someone broke into my house last night. They took my laptop and the original documents about Robert's development plans. But that's not the worst part. They left a message. She sent me a photo of what they'd written on her wall. 'Keep quiet or lose everything.' That was it. No more playing defense." I immediately called James. "They're escalating faster than we expected," he said after I updated him. "The eminent domain play is desperate. They know it won't hold up in court, but they're hoping to force the issue before we can stop them." "What about Sarah? They're clearly willing to use physical intimidation now." "I've already called in some favors. 2 retired police officers I trust will keep watch on her house. But Mike, you need to be careful too. Robert's backed into a corner, and that makes him dangerous." As evening approached, I prepared for the HOA meeting. James had advised me not to attend, warning that it was probably a trap, but I had other plans. "Trust me," I told him, "they're not the only ones who can set a trap." I spent the next hour carefully preparing my evidence and coordinating with our allies. Sarah, despite her fear, agreed to attend the meeting. Brian Foster would be there, too, ready to testify about their previous schemes. Clayton had prepared a detailed report exposing the fraudulent environmental testing. Most importantly, James had contacted state and federal authorities with our evidence. They were very interested in Robert's pattern of fraud across multiple states. At 6:45 p.m., I walked into the community center for the emergency meeting. The room was packed, but the atmosphere was tense. Robert sat at the head table, flanked by Jennifer Harris and several board members who were clearly in his pocket. As I took my seat, I noticed something odd. Several unfamiliar faces in the crowd, trying too hard to look like ordinary residents. James had warned me Robert might plant people to support his agenda. The meeting began with Robert's usual performance about community safety and property values. But when he reached the part about the environmental hazards on my property, I made my move. Standing up, phone in hand, I began playing the security footage from the previous night, showing his men attempting to break into my garage. Then I played his threat from this morning, captured perfectly on my body camera. "Would you like to explain these, Mr. Davidson? Or should we discuss the fraudulent environmental testing, or maybe the pattern of corruption across multiple states?" The room erupted in chaos. Robert's face turned purple with rage, but before he could respond, the door opened and several serious-looking men in suits entered. "Robert Davidson," one announced, holding up a badge. "I'm Agent Phillips with the FBI's Real Estate Fraud Division. We need to have a discussion about Davidson Development Group's business practices." The trap had sprung perfectly, but Robert had one last card to play, and it would turn this conflict from a legal battle into something much more dangerous. The community center erupted into chaos as FBI agent Phillips and his team made their way toward Robert Davidson. But Robert, ever the showman, wasn't about to go down without orchestrating one final, dramatic performance. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice cutting through the commotion, "what you're witnessing is a perfect example of one resident's desperate attempts to undermine our community's stability." He pulled out a stack of papers from his briefcase. "Fortunately, I came prepared for this eventuality." Jennifer Harris quickly stepped forward, assuming her practiced legal stance. "Before any further accusations are made, I should inform everyone that we've filed an emergency injunction with the county court. Mr. Thompson's allegations are part of a documented pattern of disruptive behavior." Agent Phillips appeared unimpressed. "Miss Harris, I'd advise you to choose your next words very carefully. We have evidence suggesting your direct involvement in multiple instances of real estate fraud." The room had become deathly quiet, with neighbors looking back and forth between Robert and me like spectators at a tennis match. That's when Sarah Miller stood up, her hands shaking but her voice steady. "I'd like to testify about the threats made against me," she announced. Several gasps echoed through the room as people recognized their former HOA president, very much not in Florida. Robert's composed facade cracked slightly. "Sarah, remember your non-disclosure agreement. One word from you and what, Robert?" I interrupted, holding up my phone. "You'll break into her house again, leave more threatening messages. We have it all on camera." Mrs. Henderson, my elderly neighbor with the golden retriever, suddenly spoke up from the back. "Is that why those strange men were at Sarah's house last night? Cooper kept barking at them, but I thought I was just being paranoid." The floodgates opened. One by one, neighbors began sharing their stories of Robert's harassment, excessive fines, and suspicious property inspections. Tom and Maria Rodriguez presented the evidence they'd gathered from the county records office, showing the pattern of forced sales and shell companies. Robert attempted to regain control of the meeting. "These are all baseless accusations. We have documented evidence of serious violations." "Like your fraudulent environmental testing?" Clayton stepped forward, holding up his report. "I've submitted a detailed analysis to the EPA showing how your team attempted to plant evidence of contamination. Dr. Maxwell, by the way, is now cooperating with authorities." Jennifer Harris turned pale at this revelation. She began gathering her papers, clearly preparing to make an exit. But two FBI agents moved to block the door. That's when Robert played his final card. "Even if you dismiss the environmental concerns," he said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge, "there's still the matter of the HOA's eminent domain authority. The board has already voted—" "About that vote," interrupted Mrs. Chen, standing up shakily, "I have something to show everyone." She held up her phone, playing a recording of Robert bribing board members to support his proposals. "I may be old, but I know how to use the voice memo app." The room exploded with angry shouts and accusations. Neighbors who had initially bought into Robert's schemes now turned on him, demanding explanations for years of excessive fines and suspicious property sales. Agent Phillips raised his voice above the din. "Mr. Davidson, we have enough evidence to arrest you for wire fraud, conspiracy, and multiple violations of real estate law. I suggest you come with us quietly." But Robert wasn't finished. He pulled out one final document with a flourish. "Before you do anything, you might want to see this. Mr. Thompson's property isn't just contaminated, it's already been sold." My heart skipped a beat as he slapped a deed on the table. Signed and notarized this morning. The property now belongs to Davidson Development Group through completely legal channels. James, who had been quietly observing until now, stepped forward with a smile. I was wondering when you'd try this. Did you really think we wouldn't anticipate a forged deed? The county recorder's office has been monitoring all transactions related to Mike's property. Any attempted transfers would be flagged immediately. Robert's face contorted with rage. You don't understand. This development is worth millions. I've invested everything, including your freedom. Agent Phillips interjected, pulling out handcuffs. Robert Davidson, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, wire fraud, and multiple counts of racketeering. As the FBI agents led Robert away, Jennifer Harris attempted one last legal maneuver. This entire meeting is inadmissible. The HOA bylaws clearly state, Ms. Harris, Agent Phillips cut her off. Given your involvement in these schemes, I suggest you focus on finding a good criminal defense attorney. Your law license will likely be suspended pending investigation. The community center became a flurry of activity as FBI agents began collecting statements from residents. Years of Robert's corruption were finally being exposed, with neighbors sharing story after story of harassment, fraud, and intimidation. Sarah Miller approached me, tears in her eyes. I should have spoken up sooner. Maybe fewer people would have been hurt. You spoke up when it mattered most, I assured her. Your evidence helped expose their entire operation. As the evening wound down, Agent Phillips pulled me aside. Mr. Thompson, we'll need you to come down to the field office tomorrow to make a formal statement. What you've helped uncover here appears to be part of a much larger real estate fraud scheme operating across multiple states. Looking around the community center, I saw neighbors hugging, crying, and sharing their stories of survival against Robert's corruption. The wall of fear and suspicion he had built was crumbling, replaced by a sense of relief and renewed community spirit. Tom Rodriguez clapped me on the shoulder. You know what this means, right? We need a new HOA board. Someone suggested you should run for president. I laughed, shaking my head. Let's focus on getting my car back first. Then we can talk about rebuilding our community the right way. As I walked home that night, past the ridiculous violation, flags and security cameras that would soon be removed, I felt a profound sense of vindication. Robert had tried to steal not just my property, but the peace and security of an entire community. In the end, his own arrogance and greed had been his undoing. The days following Robert's arrest were a whirlwind of activity. FBI agents descended on the HOA office, carting away boxes of documents and hard drives. The scope of Robert's corruption proved even larger than we'd imagined. My first priority was retrieving my car. With Robert and Jennifer Harris in custody, James was able to secure an emergency court order, forcing the towing company to release my Mustang. When I arrived at their lot, I was shocked by what I found. They tried to move it last night, the lot manager explained, showing me the security footage. 2 guys in a flatbed truck with paperwork, supposedly from the HOA. If we hadn't been warned by the FBI to watch for suspicious activity, your car might have disappeared forever. Fortunately, my grandfather's Mustang was unharmed, though it needed a thorough cleaning after its stay in the impound lot. As I drove it home, neighbors came out to wave and cheer. The car had become a symbol of resistance against Robert's corruption. The FBI's investigation revealed staggering details about the scope of Robert's operation. Davidson Development Group had targeted over 20 different communities across 5 states, always using the same playbook: infiltrate the HOA board, harass homeowners with violations, force sales through fraudulent environmental claims, then flip the properties for massive profits. Your case broke the whole thing wide open, Agent Phillips told me during my formal statement. We've been tracking similar patterns for months, but could never prove the connection. The evidence you gathered provided the missing links we needed. The numbers were astronomical. In our community alone, Robert's schemes had forced the sale of 12 properties, generating over $3 million in fraudulent profits. When FBI forensic accountants traced the money, they found a complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts. But the real bombshell came when they searched Robert's home office. Hidden behind a false wall, they discovered detailed files on every property he'd targeted, including surveillance photos, personal information about residents, and strategies for forcing them out. My file was particularly thick, with notes describing me as stubborn and potentially dangerous to the operation. Sarah Miller's testimony proved crucial. She provided details about how Robert had systematically corrupted our HOA board, using a combination of bribes and blackmail to secure their cooperation. Several board members were now facing criminal charges of their own. He had dirt on everyone, Sarah explained during a community meeting. If bribes didn't work, he'd find or manufacture something to hold over them. That's why I ran to Florida. He threatened to frame me for embezzlement if I didn't step down. Jennifer Harris, Robert's attorney, quickly turned state's evidence when faced with multiple felony charges. Her testimony revealed that the development scheme went beyond just our neighborhood. Robert had been working with corrupt city officials to secretly rezone entire residential areas for commercial development. The environmental testing scam was his masterpiece, she admitted. Who would fight back when their property was declared a health hazard? Most people just took the lowball offers and ran. The ripple effect spread through the community. The FBI set up a hotline for victims of Robert's schemes, and the stories poured in. Elderly residents forced from their homes by fraudulent violations, families bankrupted by excessive fines, lives disrupted or destroyed by Robert's greed. Mrs. Chen organized a support group for affected residents, meetings where people could share their experiences and begin to heal. The stories were heartbreaking, but there was also a growing sense of empowerment as people realized they weren't alone. He made us all feel isolated, Mrs. Chen explained. We were too afraid to talk to each other, too ashamed to admit we were being harassed. That was his real power, turning neighbors against each other. The legal consequences came swiftly. Robert was denied bail, deemed a flight risk due to his offshore accounts and multiple false identities discovered during the investigation. Jennifer Harris's law license was suspended pending disciplinary proceedings. The corrupt board members faced a mix of criminal charges and civil lawsuits. But the most satisfying moment came when the court appointed a receiver to take control of Davidson Development Group's assets. The receiver discovered that Robert had stolen over $15 million from various communities through his schemes. The judge ordered all his assets frozen and appointed a special master to oversee restitution to his victims. It's not just about the money, James explained during a community meeting. The court's ruling establishes a precedent for HOA abuse cases. Future boards will think twice before trying similar schemes. The community began to rebuild. A temporary board was appointed with strict oversight from the court. All of Robert's rule changes and fines were invalidated. The ridiculous violation flags were removed from my lawn, and the surveillance equipment was dismantled. Tom Rodriguez led the effort to draft new HOA bylaws with input from every resident. The focus shifted from punishment to community support. Committees were formed to help elderly residents with maintenance, organize community events, and rebuild the trust that Robert had destroyed. This is what an HOA should be, Tom declared during a planning session. Neighbors helping neighbors, not looking for ways to fine each other. The FBI's investigation continued to uncover new details. Robert's files revealed potential targets in other communities, leading to warnings that helped prevent similar schemes from taking root. His contacts in city government were exposed, leading to multiple resignations and criminal investigations. Brian Foster's parents received special attention from the restitution fund. The stress of losing their home had contributed to his father's stroke, and the court ordered full compensation for their medical expenses and property loss. "You did what I couldn't," Brian told me, tears in his eyes. "You stood up to them, and 1. Dad's getting better now, and knowing that Robert's going to prison has helped more than any medicine." Sarah Miller declined offers to return as HOA president, preferring to focus on helping other communities identify and prevent similar schemes. She became a sought-after speaker at HOA conferences, sharing her experiences and warning signs of corruption. As for my Mustang, it became something of a local celebrity. The story of how a classic car helped expose a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme made national news. Car enthusiasts from around the country sent messages of support, and several classic car clubs organized fundraisers to help Robert's victims. "Your grandfather would be proud," Mrs. Henderson told me one evening as I worked on the car in my garage. "You didn't just save his legacy, you saved our whole community." The surveillance cameras that once felt threatening were replaced with security systems owned and controlled by individual homeowners. The community Facebook group transformed from a platform for accusations into a place for sharing positive news and organizing support for neighbors in need. Robert Davidson's sentencing hearing was scheduled for a crisp morning in October, exactly 6 months after his arrest. The federal courthouse was packed with victims from multiple communities, all eager to see justice served. I sat in the front row alongside Sarah Miller, the Rodriguez family, and Mrs. Chen. Brian Foster was there too, supporting his parents who had traveled from another state to deliver their victim impact statement. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation. Robert looked nothing like the polished, arrogant HOA president we'd known. His designer suits had been replaced by prison orange, his carefully styled hair now unkempt. But his eyes still held that calculating look as he surveyed the crowded courtroom. The evidence presented during the hearing was staggering. The FBI's final investigation revealed that Robert's scheme had victimized over 200 homeowners across 5 states, generating more than $20 million in fraudulent profits. The environmental testing scam alone had forced dozens of families from their homes. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, "the defendant didn't just commit fraud, he destroyed communities. He turned neighbors against each other, exploited people's fears, and used HOA authority as a weapon for personal gain." One by one, victims took the stand to share their stories. Mrs. Foster spoke about her husband's stroke and their lost retirement savings. Sarah Miller detailed the threats and intimidation she'd faced. Each testimony painted a picture of lives disrupted by greed and corruption. When it was my turn to speak, I focused not just on my experience, but on the broader impact of Robert's crimes. "He didn't just target properties," I told the court. "He targeted people's sense of security, their trust in their neighbors, their belief in community." Robert's defense attorney attempted to paint him as a misunderstood businessman who had merely been aggressive in pursuing development opportunities. But the evidence told a different story. The judge was particularly interested in the files found in Robert's hidden wall safe, detailed plans for expanding his scheme to other communities. "Mr. Davidson," the judge said, her voice stern, "your actions represent a profound breach of trust and an extraordinary level of premeditated fraud. The court cannot ignore the devastating impact you've had on countless families." The sentence came down like a thunderbolt: 25 years in federal prison, forfeiture of all assets, and restitution payments to victims totaling over $30 million. Jennifer Harris, who had cooperated with prosecutors, received 8 years. The corrupt board members faced sentences ranging from 3 to 5 years. But the impact of our case extended far beyond individual punishments. The FBI's investigation had exposed critical vulnerabilities in HOA governance that enabled corruption. State legislators began drafting new laws requiring greater transparency and oversight of HOA boards. Our community became a model for HOA reform. The new bylaws we developed, focused on resident support rather than punishment, were adopted by other communities across the country. Sarah Miller helped create a national database for tracking HOA fraud patterns, making it harder for schemes like Robert's to take root. Back in our neighborhood, the changes were profound. The new HOA board, elected with unprecedented resident participation, implemented a completely different approach to community management. All board meetings were live-streamed and recorded. Financial records were made fully transparent. Violations had to be verified by multiple board members. Fines could be appealed to an independent review committee. Major decisions required direct resident voting. The spirit of the community transformed. The fear and suspicion Robert had cultivated were replaced by genuine neighborly concern. When Mrs. Henderson broke her hip, residents organized a schedule to help with her yard work and dog walking. When the Chen family faced unexpected medical bills, the community held a fundraiser. My Mustang became a symbol of this transformation. Instead of being targeted as a violation, it was now featured at community events. I started teaching basic car maintenance classes in my garage, sharing my grandfather's legacy of knowledge and craftsmanship with interested neighbors. The Rodriguez family's teenage son, Max, became my most dedicated student. "You know," he told me one day as we worked on the engine, "before all this happened, people were afraid to even talk to their neighbors. Now look at us." He was right. The security cameras that once spied on residents were replaced with children playing in front yards. The violation flags that had dotted lawns gave way to community garden projects. The Facebook group that had spread fear now coordinated volunteer efforts and celebrated neighbor achievements. 1 year after Robert's sentencing, we organized a community celebration, not just of our victory over corruption, but of our renewal as a neighborhood. Tables lined the streets, filled with potluck dishes from every culture represented in our community. Children played games on lawns that had once been marked with violation flags. Classic cars, including my Mustang, were displayed proudly in driveways. Sarah Miller, who had found her voice as an advocate for HOA reform, gave a moving speech. "What Robert never understood," she said, "was that a community's strength isn't in its rules or property values, it's in its people. When we stand together, corruption doesn't stand a chance." The FBI's investigation eventually led to broader reforms in real estate and HOA laws. Agent Phillips became a regular speaker at industry conferences, using our case as a textbook example of how corruption can be exposed and defeated. "The Thompson case," he would say, "showed us that the best defense against corruption is an engaged and united community. One person standing up can inspire others to do the same." As for my grandfather's Mustang, it now sits in my garage more beautiful than ever. A testament to perseverance and principle. Every time I work on it, I remember his lessons about standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. The visitors touring other classic cars often ask me to tell the story of how a classic Mustang helped bring down a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. I always tell them the same thing. It wasn't just about the car. It was about a community, finding its voice and its courage. Today, our neighborhood is stronger than ever. We've learned that an HOA doesn't have to be an instrument of control. It can be a tool for building genuine community. The lessons we learned and the changes we fought for continue to inspire other communities facing similar challenges. Robert Davidson thought he could break our community spirit through fear and intimidation. Instead, he taught us the power of standing together against corruption. In the end, that lesson was worth more than any property value. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.